Hey, welcome back. As you know, I spent the entire last lesson showing you how to get Exchange Server up and running. And we did a lot in that lesson. We set up a couple of mailbox servers, we set up an Edge server, and we even set up an Edge subscription. So we've got Exchange up and running and almost ready to use, but not quite. Because you see, there are a few post installation tasks that we need to work through before Exchange would be ready to use in a production environment. So I've got a few of those post installation tasks listed on this slide. Now, before I delve into these tasks, one thing that you need to know is that the list is by no means all inclusive or universally applicable. You see, every Exchange server organization is different. Every company or nonprofit or what have you that deploys Exchange server does it in a slightly different way that fits the needs of their own institution. So, depending on how Exchange is set up, there might be additional tasks that need to be performed after installation, or there's a chance that maybe some of the tasks that are listed on the slide are unnecessary, depending on how Exchange has been set up and configured. But what are some of the more common tasks? Well, entering a product key, reviewing the setup log, reviewing the application log in Event Viewer, because really you want to make sure that Exchange was deployed successfully and that you don't have any major problems. Also, renaming the mailbox database. It's not really an essential task, but it's something that I highly recommend doing for reasons that you'll see as we go along throughout this and some of the other videos. And moving the databases and the transaction logs. So in this video, I'm going to show you how to do all of this. So we've really got our work cut out for us, so let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing that we want to do following the installation process is to enter a product key for our Exchange server. And there are two ways you can do this. You can use the Exchange Admin Center, or you can use the Exchange Management Shell. If you decide to use the Exchange Management Shell, then you would do this by using the set-exchange server commandlet, followed by the name of the server, and then you're going to specify the product key switch followed by the product key. I've just used a bunch of X's right here as opposed to an actual product key, but this is what the command would look like. Now, if on the other hand you prefer to use the GUI, then what you would do is you would open the Exchange Admin Center and you would go to Servers, select a server, and click Edit. And then you would go to the General tab and choose the Change Product Key option. So I'll show you what that looks like in just 1 second. But before I do, one thing that I need to point out is that regardless of which method you use, you're going to need to restart the Microsoft Exchange Information Store service after you enter a product key. Otherwise, Exchange won't acknowledge that the product key has been entered. So let's take a look at how you would go about entering a product key. Okay, so here I am in the Exchange Admin Center, and what I would do is go to the Servers tab right here, and I'm presented with a list of all of my servers. Incidentally, a product key has to be entered separately for each server. So what I would do is I would pick the server that I want to enter the product key for, and the way that the Microsoft documentation tells you to do it is to select the server and then click Edit, which is this icon right here. And then the General tab contains an option to enter your product key. So you would just type your product key right here, and then once the product key has been entered, you would click Save. I'm going to go ahead and cancel out of this. And the other thing that I wanted to show you is that as a shortcut, you'll notice that there's a link right here to enter a product key. So you could just click this link and that would do exactly the same thing. It would open up the same browser window and you could simply type your product key and click Save. Now, as previously mentioned, once you enter a product key, you're going to have to restart the information store. So the way that you would do that is by right-clicking on the Start button, and I'm on an Exchange server right now, and I'm just going to go to Run, and then I'm going to enter services.msc at the run prompt, and that's going to launch the Service Control Manager. So here's the Service Control Manager, and you can see all of the services that are installed on the system as well as the status reflecting whether or not the service is running. So I'm just going to make this a little bigger so it's easier to see, and I'm going to scroll down to the Exchange section. So here you can see that we have a lot of different Microsoft Exchange related services. And I'm going to expand this column a bit just to make this a little easier to read. And as I scroll through here, you'll notice that we have one marked the Microsoft Exchange Information Store. This is the service that we have to restart. And this is disruptive to your users, so I would recommend restarting this at a time that's a little bit more convenient as opposed to the middle of the workday. And you're just going to right-click on this and go to Restart, and that's going to restart the service. So once the service restart finishes, your product key should be registered and you should be good to go. So I'm going to go ahead and close this out. Now the next thing that we want to do is check some of the logs just to make sure that Exchange was installed properly and that everything is functional. So the first log that I recommend checking is the setup log. So I'm going to go into File Explorer And it's also a good idea to check and make sure you've got plenty of disk space at this point, because I have seen installations in which, for whatever reason, temp files just accumulated and ran the server almost completely out of disk space. If that happens, then you can go into C and go into Windows and just take a look at the temp folder. There may be files in there that you can get rid of. You can see that we've got quite a few files right here. I'm not going to worry about this because the server has plenty of disk space, but it's just something I thought I'd mention. At any rate, when it comes to checking the log files, the first thing that I recommend checking is the setup files. So go into your C drive and go to Exchange Setup Logs, which we have right here. And then the file that you're looking for is exchange setup.log. Now, Windows hides file extensions by default, so it just appears as Exchange Setup. This is the file that we want to look at. So I'm going to go ahead and open this up. And you can see that there is very verbose logging information about the setup process. So you would want to go through here and just make sure that there aren't any big problems. Now you'll notice we have a couple of errors right here, and the reason for those errors has to do with the way that I installed Exchange. If you think back to the previous lesson, you'll recall that my first Exchange server was installed with the intent of creating several different types of setup errors so that you could see what those errors look like. And those errors are reflected in the log, so that's what we're seeing right here. So I'm going to go ahead and close this out. And then the next thing that I recommend checking out is the application log within the event viewer. So I'm going to go ahead and open up the event viewer, and the way that I'm going to do that is by opening Server Manager, and then I'll go to Tools and Event Viewer. So here's the event viewer, and I'll enlarge this. And if I expand Windows logs, we have an application log, and the application log contains log file entries related to Exchange Server. So it's a good idea to go through here and just make sure that you don't have any major problems. Now, if you do happen to see some error messages in here, typically you'll find it's not the end of the world. A lot of times it's small things. Even this server has a couple of minor error messages listed, and we could click on those errors and find out exactly what's going on. So for example, in this one, we have a message saying failed to connect to the Edge transport server. And that's something that turned out, in my case, to be a DNS domain name resolution issue, and it's something that I've already corrected. There are other places that you can look for Exchange-related information. For example, you notice that I have a container right here, Applications and Service Logs. If I expand this, you can see that we do have some Exchange-related logs here. So we have MS Exchange Management, for example. I could click on that and find information related to Exchange Management. And I've got a bunch of errors in here. And it looks like these errors were related to a commandlet failure, related to get notification. So this may be tied to slow virtual machine performance. It's something I'll certainly have to look into later on. But on the surface, as I'm looking through this, I'm not seeing anything that would indicate that Exchange Server had installed incorrectly or anything like that. So I'm going to go ahead and close this out, and we'll move forward with the rest of the post-installation tasks. Now, the next task that I recommend doing is renaming the mailbox databases. So why is this? Well, the default mailbox database names are fine. You can use those if you like. But those names tend to be a little bit cryptic. Mailbox databases are by default named mailbox database and then a great big long number. What I've found with working with Exchange is that very often you have to reference an individual mailbox database through the Exchange management shell. And it can become very tedious and error prone to have to type that great big long database name every time you have to reference a database. So it's a lot more effective to just shorten the name to something easy to type. Plus, if you use a little bit of imagination, you can even pick a name that helps reflect which server that database is related to. So I'll show you what this looks like in just a second. But first, I want to show you the commands that we'll be using. The first command is get-mailbox database. And what this command is going to do is it's going to show us a list of all of the mailbox databases that exist within the Exchange organization. Then what we're going to do is type set-mailbox database. We're going to type the original mailbox database name. That's, in this case, the default name that Exchange assigned during the setup process. And then we're going to use the -name switch and then the new name. So let's go ahead and rename some mailbox databases. Okay, so I've switched over to one of my mailbox servers and I've opened up the Exchange management shell. Now, incidentally, you'll recall a few minutes ago I was looking through the event logs and one of the logs contained a really long list of errors. I did a little bit of digging and found the cause of that error. And what it was that a few minutes ago when I restarted the Microsoft Exchange Information Store service, the service didn't restart correctly, even though it said it did. So I restarted that service one more time, and that seems to have fixed the problems. So I just thought I would throw that out there for anybody who's curious about those errors that you saw earlier. So let's get down to the task at hand, renaming a mailbox database. Let me go ahead and clear this just so that we've got a little bit of room to work with. So let's rename our mailbox databases. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to type get-mailbox database, and this should give me a list of the mailbox databases that exist within my Exchange organization. So you can see that I've got one mailbox database on EXCH1, another one on EXCH2. You can have multiple databases on each server, but I've only got one on each server. Now, this is what I was talking about earlier with the mailbox database names. These are the default names. They're both called mailbox database and then some big long number. So it makes sense to shorten this into something that's easier to type so that it'll make Exchange just a little bit easier to work with in the future. So let's go ahead and rename these mailbox databases. So I'm going to type set-mailbox database and then quotation marks mailbox database and then 1679441682 and then dash name. And because this one's on server EXCH1, I'm just going to call it DB1. And assuming that I haven't made any typos, the mailbox database should be renamed. Okay, that command's done. So let's rename the next one. I'm going to repeat exactly the same command. I'm just going to press the up arrow. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to change this number to reflect the second database. And that one is 009-469-3624. And I'll press enter, and that one should be renamed. Nope, apparently I've made a typo here. And I see right away what that typo was. What I did was I continued to name this DB1 when I already named the last one DB1. So I need to change this to DB2 because it's going on server EXCH2. That's what I intended to do in the first place, but got a little ahead of myself. So I'm going to press enter, and that should rename that database. Now, if I go back and I type get-mailbox database, we should see the new database names. And there are the databases named DB1 and DB2. So we have succeeded at renaming our mailbox databases. So I'm just going to go ahead and clear the screen. So the last thing that I'm going to cover is moving the mailbox databases and the corresponding transaction logs. So by default, Exchange places the database and the transaction logs on the system volume, but you really don't want them there because you don't want system-related disk I/O negatively impacting database performance. Microsoft recommends that you place the database and the transaction logs on completely separate disks, because if you happen to lose the volume containing the database, well then the transaction logs are on a separate disk where they're not affected by the failure, and you can use those transaction logs to help recover the database. So here are the commands that I'm going to be using. I'm going to start out by typing get-mailbox database. You saw this a second ago. That provides us a list of the mailbox databases. Then I'm going to type move-database path. We're going to provide the name of the database that we want to move. And then from there, we have a choice. We can move the database, we can move the log files, or we can move both. This command assumes that we want to move both. So we have the -edb file path switch. This is used for moving the database. And then we have the path and the file name of the database. Then we have the -log folder path switch, which is used for moving the transaction logs. And then we have the path to the transaction logs. So let me show you an example. In our example, we have move-database path, and then we have DB1, which is the new name for the database that we just renamed, and then we have -edb file path. Remember, this is for moving the database, and we're going to move that database to /db1/ and then we have to provide the database name. In this case, it's db1.edb. Then we're going to move the transaction logs, so we're going to use the -log folder path switch, and we're going to specify that we want the transaction logs moved to f:/db1. So that's how we're going to do this. Let me switch back over to my Exchange server, and we'll move the database. Okay, so I'm back on my Exchange server, and before I move the database, I'm going to open up File Explorer. And you'll notice that right now we only have a C drive, and then we've got a DVD drive that's mapped to D. So there is no ENF to move the database to, so we need to take care of that. This particular virtual machine has virtual hard drives that we can use for ENF, but they're not there yet. So I'm going to right-click on the Start button, and I'm going to go to Run, and I'm going to type Disk Management, diskmgmt.msc, and that's going to launch the Disk Management console. So when the Disk Management console opens, you can see that we've got a couple of unknown disks right here. These are eventually going to become ENF. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right-click on Disk 1, and I'm going to choose Online. That's going to bring the disk online, and I'll do the same thing for Disk 2. I'll bring it online. and the status changes to not initialized. So I'm going to right click again and initialize disk, and we'll go ahead and initialize both of these. Okay, and after a short delay, the disks have been initialized. So now we need to create some volumes that we can use. So I'm going to right click on this unallocated space right here and create a new simple volume. And that's going to launch the new simple volume wizard. And I'm just going to go with the maximum size here. I'll map this one as E and click next, next, finish. And that's going to create our E drive. And now I need to do the same thing with this disk to create an F drive. So I'm going to right click and say new simple volume, next, next, and I'm going to map this one to F and click next, next, finish. So it looks like E is finished formatting. Now F is formatting. It takes just a minute for this to complete. And it looks like the process is done. So now our disks are ready to use. I'll go ahead and close this out. And you can see that now we have E and F showing up in File Explorer. So I'll close this. And now we can move forward with moving the database and the transaction logs. So I'm going to type move dash database path, and then db1 is the name of the database, and then dash edb file path, and we're going to move that to e:/db1/db1.edb, and then I'm going to use the dash log folder path switch, and I'm going to set that to f:/db1, and press enter. And this takes just a second, so I'm going to pause the video for a moment. And we're prompted for confirmation of the move. I'm going to type yes, and yes again. Okay, so it looks like the process has finished. I'm going to go ahead and close this out, and I'm going to open File Explorer, and we can just take a look at the elements that have been moved to drives E and F. So I'll go into E, and there's the DB1 folder, and there's my Exchange Server database. And I back out and go to F. There's a folder called DB1, and there are my transaction logs. And you'll notice I didn't create that folder. Exchange Server created that for me as a part of the move. So those are just some of the post-installation tasks that you might want to perform as a part of the Exchange Server deployment.